It began with a single act of defiance. One man, one sub, and one federal agent in full tactical gear. When the government launched its crackdown on lawlessness in America's cities, this moment was the opening salvo. The trial was called United States versus Dunn, but let's be honest, everyone else called it US versus Sandwich Guy. That's right, the Department of Justice finally indicted a ham sandwich. But in the end, it didn't cut the mustard. They couldn't get a conviction. But after the verdict, the internet feasted on puns, collected in this blue sky thread by Supreme Court reporter Lawrence Hurley. He beat the rap, says Andrew Seitz. Any way you slice it, said someone named Oracle's 671, the case's host. It'll give them something to chew on, says Emma McFarlane. And Mr. Fate was, quote, pleased they saw it as a load of baloney, a ham-fisted attempt to silence the people. And now hopefully we can beget all about it and move on. Let us rejoice, says Matt Ewer. Tony DeCorso said with relish. All because defendant Sean Dunn's act became a symbol of DC's resistance against the regime. Banksy-like art of him seemed to pop up overnight. We still don't know who made it, but it was everywhere, including on Halloween. But behind the jokes and street art was a serious question. Could the federal government really get DC to convict one of their own for throwing a sandwich? The answer was no. But let's meet the defendant, a 37-year-old Sean Dunn, a former DOJ paralegal, who decided to express his political views through a salami sub. Dunn thought the officers were about to do an immigration raid at a gay nightclub on Latin night. And he had some thoughts about that. Video from last August shows Dunn hurling the sandwich squarely at the chest of a federal agent who, to be fair, was wearing a lot of tactical gear, including a bulletproof vest. The clip quickly went viral. The incident happened at the start of Trump's invasion of American cities. And we made a video about what it felt like to have the National Guard deployed to a very dangerous city.
I'm here at the National Zoo and it is pandemonium, by which I mean there are pandas here. When a very small line developed at the Starbucks across the street, I was worried that all hell was going to break loose. Luckily, the security measures in place seem to be holding a careful peace.
Now, initially, the Metro Police arrested Sandwich Guy for assault and disorderly conduct, but they let him go without charges. But then a video of the event went viral, and the government had egg on its face. That's because bullies hate to be humiliated. So then the Trump administration decided to make an example out of Dunn. They sent a SWAT team to his studio apartment, even though he offered to voluntarily surrender. They even produced a shameful propaganda film all about it. And I'll let you think about the time, effort, and taxpayer dollars that went into this moment. They hired videographers, deployed an entire SWAT team to arrest someone who would have turned themselves in. And that, of course, was a preview of what the administration would later unleash in Chicago, brute force being used against the local population, punctuated with propaganda films they spit out on social media.
Waited to strike like snakes. But I'm there too. Watching.
Jeanine Pirro, who I still can't believe is the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, relished the opportunity to prosecute Dunn. Here she is explaining why Sandwich Guy was a menace to society.
An individual went up to one of the federal law enforcement officers and started jumping up and down, screaming at him, berating him, yelling at him. And then he took a Subway sandwich about this big and took it and threw it at the officer. He thought it was funny. Well, he doesn't think it's funny today because we charged him with a felony, assault on a police officer. And we're going to back the police to the hilt. So there, stick your Subway sandwich somewhere else.
And so she apparently charged Dunn with a felony assault on a federal officer. The government also took away Dunn's livelihood. Pam Bondi fired him after the video went viral, and she announced it in the place where all the serious mean girls go to post their sickest burns. Quote, if you touch any law enforcement officer, we will come after you. I just learned that this defendant worked at the Department of Justice. No longer. Not only is he fired, he has been charged with a felony. This is an example of the deep state we've been up against for several months as we work to refocus DOJ. You will not work in this administration while disrespecting our government and law enforcement. Anyway, according to the criminal complaint, Dunn, quote, pointed his finger in victim one's face and yelled, "F you, you fucking fascist. Why are you here? I don't want you in my city." And the alleged victim was CPB agent Gregory Larimore. And the complaint explains that, quote, at approximately 11:06 p.m., Dunn approached victim one and threw a sandwich at him, striking victim one in the chest. An Instagram video recorded by an observer captured the incident. The video depicts Dunn screaming at victim one within inches of his face for several seconds before winding his arms back and forcefully throwing a sub-style sandwich at victim one. And as you can see here, once he threw the sub, he ran like hell and the CPB officer chased him down. Or as Detective Henry put it, quote, Dunn attempted to flee on foot but was apprehended. Eventually. The prosecutors tried to indict Dunn for felony assault of a federal officer in violation of 18 U.S.C. section 111A1, which we've been seeing a lot of as it's being used as basically a catch-all for anything related to protests. But it says, quote, whoever forcibly assaults, resists, imposes, impedes, intimidates, or interferes with law enforcement officer has committed simple assault. Now, 18 U.S.C. section 111 is a felony when the assault involves a deadly or dangerous weapon or causes bodily injury. The penalty for felony assault is up to 8 years in prison. So if we go back and look at the film, there's an obvious problem, right? A sub sandwich is not a deadly weapon and the officer doesn't appear to be injured. And that's what the grand jury thought too. The jurors refused to even indict Dunn on felony assault. Now, the Department of Justice could have dropped the case, but instead they downgraded it from a felony to a misdemeanor assault, no grand jury needed. Now, misdemeanor assault is covered by subsection A. This is basically simple assault, meaning no weapon and relatively minimal force. It carries a maximum penalty of up to 1 year in jail. And for extremely obvious reasons, federal prosecutors rarely bother bringing misdemeanor charges. They have bigger fish to fry, or at least they're supposed to. And if prosecutors do charge someone with misdemeanor assault, the case rarely goes to trial. They're usually handled through a plea deal or diversion program, especially when there's no injury and the defendant isn't a repeat offender. If an offender takes the deal, it comes with conditions: pay a fine, stay out of trouble for a certain amount of time, and maybe take an anger management class. In Dunn's case, we don't know if prosecutors offered a deal, but the broader point here isn't the sandwich, it's the climate. Dunn's prosecution for a minor offense is part of a much bigger picture. The early wave of arrests during Trump's National Guard deployments, the national emergency, where even minor confrontations with federal agents were treated as potential federal crimes. Even if the DOJ offered a deal, Dunn might not have taken it, especially after he became a symbol of resistance around the city. Amusingly, the event has even been memorialized on posters and murals. People around DC even added Dunn to their Halloween decorations, like these giant skeletons holding a sub. And it appears that given all that's at stake, Dunn chose to make a stand. It looks like he chose to fight it on the merits, or just hoped the jury was pissed off and would nullify. But first, the defense tried to get the case thrown out for vindictive and selective prosecution. Quote, "The DC U.S. Attorney's Office cannot identify a single comparable case, one involving the tossing of a soft object at a law enforcement officer, where the federal response came anywhere close to this level of force, publicity, and humiliation. Indeed, as far as we can tell, no such incident has ever been prosecuted by the DC U.S. Attorney's Office. The reason why is clear. The government's extraordinary reaction here is explained not by the alleged act itself, but by the political views of the person accused of committing it." Now, the prosecution would later argue that, quote, "This case is not about someone with strong opinions, it's not about immigration, it's not about the First Amendment. It's about an individual who crossed the line. Each and every one of you has a right to their personal beliefs. However, that does not give them the right to touch another person, to strike another person, even with a sandwich." And legally speaking, that's completely true. But does anyone really think that Dunn would have been charged if the moment hadn't gone viral, launching 100 memes and artwork throughout occupied DC? And of course, this is part of a pattern. In Chicago, CBP Commander Dan Bavino testified under oath that he, quote, "instructed his officers to arrest protesters who make hyperbolic comments in the heat of political demonstrations." The Constitution protects your right to make hyperbolic comments even and especially during protests. But the administration foreshadowed that it would blur the line between speech and violence in Trump's executive order, quote, "countering domestic terrorism and organized political violence." There, Trump ordered Pam Bondi to use Section 111 liberally to achieve its political goals. And statutes criminalizing assault on law enforcement officers are ripe for abuse. These laws often include vague language, allowing the police to charge people for passive resistance, verbal disagreements, or extremely minor contact. And in fact, our own Liz Dye covered this in her video about the prosecution of congressional candidate Kate Abu. She and 5 other people were charged with conspiracy to impede a law enforcement officer and individual counts of impeding an officer in violation of, you guessed it, 18 U.S.C. 111. And that's the same statute that they used to charge the sandwich guy here. And if that irony wasn't enough, adding to the flavor of this trial, most of the precedent involving Section 111 comes from trials involving the January 6th rioters, who have now been pardoned. And the defense also talked about this in its vindictive prosecution motion. Quote, "This court need look no further than how this same prosecuting office handled cases involving individuals with political views opposite to Mr. Dunn's, who committed far more serious acts of violence against law enforcement officers on January 6, 2021. The contrast is stark. While Mr. Dunn's alleged sandwich toss triggered deployment of a heavily armed SWAT team for a militarized arrest, the filing of felony charges and continued prosecution even after a local court and a grand jury refused to indict, January 6 defendants, captured on video hurling explosives, beating officers with baseball bats and riot shields, and spraying chemical irritants, saw their prosecutions dismissed and their convictions pardoned. This is plain and simple political viewpoint discrimination, and the Constitution forbids it. But that motion was not successful, and the trial began appropriately on National Sandwich Day. And during the opening statements, the parties agreed on the basic facts. Assistant U.S. Attorney John Perrin said, quote, "Look, I understand you may all have views of the federal law enforcement presence in D.C., and that's fine, we're not trying to convince you otherwise. But respectfully, that's not what this case is about. This case is about the fact that you can't go around throwing stuff at people when you're mad." Perrin said that Dunn crossed a line by throwing the sandwich, which is forcible assault. And Dunn's defense lawyer, Julia Gatto, argued that Dunn was being targeted for his speech opposing the administration's policies. Quote, "He's not a fan, he thinks recent immigration enforcement is racist." And he described what is happening as fascism, which is an opinion that a lot of people share. Gatto said that the government, quote, turned that moment a thrown sandwich into a criminal case, a federal criminal case charging a federal criminal offense. She told the jury that yes, quote, he did it, he threw the sandwich. She went on to argue that the throw was, quote, an exclamation mark at the end of a verbal outburst. And that argument was probably smart. Her client is on video chucking a sandwich at a federal officer. She can't deny what happened, but she was trying to refocus the jury on what their job was. And the job was not to decide whether throwing a sandwich at an officer was a smart decision or whether it made the officer feel sad. As she put it, quote, you're not going to be asked if you feel bad for the agent who took a sandwich to the chest. You're going to be asked whether what happened that night is a federal crime. And Gatto argued that it wasn't. The prosecution, quote, will not come close to convincing you beyond a reasonable doubt the conduct was forcible. Now, Officer Larimore was the prosecution's star witness. He said on the night in question, Dunn emerged from a subway, quote, red-faced and enraged, calling me and my colleagues all kinds of names, saying we were fascist. As Larimore correctly noted, quote, that's his constitutional right to express his opinion. The prosecution played the body cam footage of the incident, including a portion where Dunn told an officer, quote, I was trying to draw them away from where they were. I succeeded. Remember, Dunn says that he thought that they were going to do an immigration raid on a gay club. Now, the government tried to emphasize the violence inherent in the throw, and they went out of their way to describe things like it was a gun. Quote, he takes the sandwich in his hand, he cocks it back. The prosecution also claimed the sandwich was thrown at, quote, point-blank range. And Larimore tried his best to describe the throw as a horrifying act of violence. He testified that he could feel the impact of the sandwich through his ballistic vest, and it, quote, smelled of onions and mustard. It exploded all over my chest. Now, it's often helpful for a witness to explain what they saw and felt during an event, but here that probably worked against him. Could he really detect the impact of the sub through his ballistic vest? Maybe. Did it explode all over his uniform? Well, we don't have to guess. Let us roll the clip. And this became a major sticking point. On cross-examination, Dunn's other lawyer, Sabrina Schroff, emphasized that the sandwich was still wrapped when it hit the ground. She showed him a photo and asked him, quote, can you tell us if it's a turkey sandwich, lettuce, tomatoes? Larimore said, from the photo, it looks bent and out of shape. He said the mustard and onions were stuck on his uniform and claimed he found a strand of onions stuck to his radio later that night. And even Larimore's comment about smelling the condiments was questionable, because the defense argued the sandwich was still in its wrapper when it hit the ground. She also asked Larimore if he could identify the sub, but he couldn't because he didn't bag and tag it as evidence. And she asked him to look closely at a photo of the sandwich on the ground, pointing out it was still in its wrapper. Quote, you don't see there's mustard on it. No. You can't tell there's ketchup on it? No. You can't tell there's mayonnaise on it? No. What about lettuce, tomato? Again, Larimore was at a loss for words. And Schroff finished him off like a grilled cheese. Quote, in fact, the sandwich hasn't exploded at all. So Schroff had distilled the case down to a simple question about whether the sub was still wrapped. And as the ever-perceptive lawyer Mike Dunford put it, quote, the wrapper didn't split, so you must acquit. And if you're cracking up right now, you aren't alone. Reporters said the jurors tried really hard not to laugh. One juror had to cover her face with a notebook to keep her composure. And the prosecution argued that Larimore was injured. But the defense proved that Larimore and his colleagues treated the incident like a big joke. Larimore received 2 gag gifts memorializing the event. One is a plushy sandwich and the other is a patch that says felony footlong. And Larimore admitted that he kept the patch on his lunchbox and the plush sandwich on his shelf. In the defense's view, this proved that he didn't find the sandwich throw offensive. And that's important because critical thinking isn't just a skill, it's a civic duty. It's what keeps justice fair, democracy functional, and public opinion grounded in facts. But that's getting harder to do when the information we rely on is filtered through political agendas, media bias, hidden special interests, and selective storytelling. And that's why I use Ground News, the sponsor of today's video. And I want to thank them for supporting this channel since 2023. And their mission is one that I believe in, empowering people to think critically by making the media landscape more transparent. But if you don't know, Ground News is an app and website that lets you compare coverage of the same story across thousands of outlets worldwide. You'll see political bias, factuality, and even who owns the sources you're reading all in one place. But understanding the news isn't just about how the story is told, it's about what stories weren't told at all. That's why one of Ground News' most powerful features is the blind spot feed. It surfaces stories that are being underreported by one side of the political spectrum, so you're not just hearing the loudest voices, you're catching the ones being left out. And as someone who cares deeply about legal reasoning, precedent, and facts, having access to transparent and accountable news coverage is essential. Ground News is the tool I trust to cut through the spin and see the full picture. And I can't recommend it enough. And as a legal eaglet, you can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan, which is the same one that I use, by clicking on the link in the description or scanning the QR code. And by subscribing, you're helping to build a more transparent, balanced media landscape. So stay sharp, stay informed, or I'll see you in court. So after hearing just 2 witnesses, the trial came to a close. Now, during closing arguments, Schroff said, quote, if someone assaulted you, someone offended you, would you keep mementos of that assault? Of course not. They all think it's funny. Schroff added, quote, "A foot long from Subway could not and certainly did not inflict bodily harm." And as Judge Nichols prepared to send the jury to deliberate, the parties argued over jury instructions. Everyone agreed that Dunn threw the sandwich. The real fight was over what was meant under federal law. Under 18 U.S.C. 111, it's a crime to forcibly assault, resist, oppose, impede, intimidate, or interfere with a federal officer. That's 6 verbs for one potential hurled grinder. And Judge Nichols decided early on that proving any one of them could be enough for conviction. So for days, the lawyers battled over the meaning of these words. What does it mean to act forcibly? What counts as an assault? The defense argued that forcibly should mean what it sounds like: real force, a risk of actual physical harm. In their view, Dunn's toss was no more forcible than, quote, an 8-year-old in the middle of a temper tantrum. And as for assault, the agent was wearing a ballistic vest designed to stop rifle fire. As defense counsel put it, quote, "That's definitely going to keep you safe from a sandwich." The prosecution, on the other hand, defined the words broadly. Force, they said, didn't require injury, just an intentional offensive act. Quote, "Here we have the defendant throwing, it's a sandwich, but throwing it hard. And when the sub hit the agent's chest, well, they said that wasn't enough. Quote, having a sandwich spiked on your chest, is that offensive to a person of reasonable sensibilities? Certainly, we have an assault." But during the government's rebuttal, they started to cross the line from act to speech, saying Dunn threw a sandwich, then he yelled and cursed. They called it an attempt to instigate. And Judge Nichols reminded jurors that Dunn's words alone were not criminal. They only mattered as evidence of his intent. But it appears the jury struggled to apply the law to the facts. And that's not easy to do. That's why jurors are allowed to ask the judge questions if they get stuck. And on the last day, the jury found themselves in a pickle. They sent the judge a note, quote, "What exactly is bodily harm? And is that different from injury?" Judge Nichols eventually told them the terms were interchangeable. Now, the defense requested a mistrial, arguing they'd built their whole case around the idea that bodily harm meant something more substantial, but the judge denied their motion. In the end, the judge instructed the jury that to convict, they had to find Dunn acted forcibly by threatening or attempting to inflict bodily harm. He said assault meant any attempt or threat to inflict injury that placed another in immediate apprehension of harm, and that injury could include any physical injury, including touching offensive to a person of reasonable sensibilities. So the verdict came down to a simple question. Would a sandwich to the chest be an offensive touching to a person of reasonable sensibilities? So let's get down to the meat of the matter. After marinating on it for several hours, the jury acquitted Dunn. As you can see on the verdict form, they found him not guilty. That means the verdict was unanimous. It's really an incredible result. One juror told the reporters that she didn't think the officer felt threatened by the sandwich and laughed when asked if she felt the sub exploded as the officer claimed. Reporters who were at the trial said jurors cracked up several times during the testimony. And 2 of Sandwich Guy's supporters, Dawn and Donna Powell, stood outside the courtroom wearing free DC pins. They said Dunn was a hero. Donna said, quote, "He's the spirit of the revolution now against the Trump administration. He expressed what a lot of us feel, which is frustration." And her husband compared Dunn's case to the January 6th case, for which Trump issued a blanket pardon. Quote, "They got off scot-free, basically. Compare that to a guy getting hit with a Subway sandwich. It's night and day." So yeah, the lesson is if you're not a Christo-fascist, you'll probably need a good lawyer to beat the rap. Luckily, I know a guy. Now, after I started this channel, every week I'd get hundreds of comments and emails from viewers who are dealing with legal problems. And they'd ask, "Can you help me find a lawyer? Or how do I know if this attorney is any good?" And there's a massive gap in our justice system. It's that people don't know how to find the right lawyer for their specific situation. They're scared, they're overwhelmed, and they end up doing nothing or hiring the first attorney who calls them back. And that really bothered me. So I started to wonder, what if there was a different way? What if we could build a law firm that actually lived up to the values that I talk about on this channel? Transparency, accessibility, and putting clients first instead of chasing billable hours. A firm where you don't need to pay anything up front, and your lawyers only get paid if you do to maximize your opportunity for justice. So a few years ago, I decided to fix that problem. I decided to start my own personal injury law firm. And honestly, it wasn't an easy choice. But I realized I was in this unique position. I had this platform, this community, and the experience. Not to get rich, trust me, there are easier ways to make money than starting a law practice. But we did it because access to justice shouldn't be a luxury. Because finding the right legal representation shouldn't feel like playing Russian roulette with your future. And when you work with my firm, you're not just getting a lawyer. You're getting a team that understands that behind every case is a real person with real stakes. If we can't represent you or you're in a state where we don't practice, we'll take the time to try to match you with an attorney in my personal network of lawyers. A national network of some of the best lawyers in the country who actually specialize in what you're going through, located right where you are, not just whoever happens to be available. So if you're dealing with a personal injury, a car crash, a data breach, sexual harassment, a social security or workers' comp issue, give us a call at the number on screen or click on the link below. Now, I can't represent everyone that watches this channel. I wish I could, but what I can do is make sure that when you need legal help, you have somewhere to turn to that you can trust. So whether it's me handling your case or the incredible attorneys we partnered with, you'll get the same principles of honesty and education that we bring to every video. And if you're dealing with a legal issue and you're not sure where to start, check out the link in the description. Let's have a conversation about how we can help you find not just a lawyer, but the right lawyer for your situation. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, making sure that when life gets complicated, you don't have to face it alone. Which is why when you need a lawyer, you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle team.